Hello, welcome to History 241 Civilizations of Asia, Session 18, the Han Dynasty from about 221 BC to 220 AD. My name is Abdul Karim Khan. I teach here at Leeward Community College. Please go to WebCT and check the latest email address as well as the phone number, and also check out if there are any assignments that are maybe due, and any reading that you might need to do. So call me at the latest phone number or email me whenever you want to, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So before we go into today's session 18 presentation about the Han Dynasty, let's see what we did in the previous session. That was about a sort of a review about the Qin Dynasty. And the Qin Dynasty, as I told you, this Q is pronounced as CH. So the Qin state and the Qin people, that's what we talked about. Also during that, how the first Qin Empire or the Chinese Empire was established. I think you might remember I said that it was from the Qin, the word Qin, that we get the European or the Arab or the Indian term for China as China. From the Qin, we get the word China for the country. It was during this period, the Qin Dynasty or the Qin state period, that we got the political unification of the country. So most of the country of China that we know, it was brought under one control. And then the extension of the Chinese border to whatever we might have is, so far these are exactly the same border that they established or later on expanded and, contracting. It was also during this Qin Dynasty state that legalism became the official policy or the state philosophy of the Qin Dynasty, and how this legalism led to what is called the bureaucratic centralism during the Qin Dynasty. And then the end of the Qin Dynasty, although it did not rule for long, but still it did a lot of great things, as we saw, especially the construction of the Chinese Wall, the Great China Wall, and how this dynasty established the borders of the of China, and how it even, started to control the Xiongnu or the Mongol people in the north. So it established pretty much, the history of China, and the future generations would look to the Qin Dynasty, how they control. And even today, as we discussed, even today there are controversies. Whatever the Qin did, was it good for China or was it bad for China? Or even if they achieved so many great things, was it good at the cost of so many people that the Qin Dynasty had to exterminate as they did, because they wanted to bring all the Chinese under their control, and so many Chinese did not want to, and hence the trouble between the unification and the disunification. So that was the Qin Dynasty, and some of these things you would see again and again repeating, like a history repeats itself, as we say. So similarly in China, in the Chinese history, these events would repeat, and most of them would be around the rise of different dynasties or the different states, that they would like to stay on their own, in their own places, and would not like to be merged or to be forced to merge into other dynasties. So that would be one, which leads to the problem of, to the solution of unification. So should China stay united, or should it stay fragmented under different kingdoms and different states, different people? So that you would see it again and again, till maybe the beginning of the 20th century. So this would be a major theme in the history of China. Also, another one that would repeat itself in China, speaking of these repetitions, which dynasty would follow what philosophy? Some of them were smart. If one did not work, one philosophy did not work, they switched to another philosophy. And the Han Dynasty gives us that type of an example. If something is not working, quit it, and move on to something else. And that's what the Han Dynasty did. They were not hung up just on one philosophy or one religion. So let's see what we are going to be doing today. in session 18. We will talk about, of course, the Han Dynasty, and first we start with the former Han Dynasty and how this Han Dynasty started with the continuation of legalism, how it borrowed, the Han Dynasty borrowed ideas from the Qin Dynasty and used it for some time and then dropped it and went completely the opposite way to Confucianism. We would talk about the most important, emperor of the Han Dynasty, Emperor Wudi. Then we would go into later Han, just like, the Zhou Dynasty was divided into two sections, like the Western Zhou and the Eastern Zhou, or the former Zhou or the later Zhou. Similarly, Han Dynasty is divided between the former Han and the later Han. Also, this Han Dynasty would end up in being broken into three major kingdoms, and that would be sort of the end of the Han rule, and somebody else would come and pick up the pieces. And so again, the same thing, how a dynasty would rule for some time, and then it would be broken. So let's see that. The Han rule, keep in mind, it's a long rule for almost 400 years. It's one of the longest, dynasty, and that's the reason it's called the Golden Age of China that happened in the Han Dynasty. And so the later dynasty would be held to the Han rule. Can you not rule like the Han? So this would be sort of a great example and a great model for the coming dynasties. The Golden Age of China happened during this time. Just like the Qin gave its name to the country China, the name of the people, of the Chinese people, is derived from the Han name. So the name of the Han Dynasty would become the name of the Chinese people. So that's why in China, even today, people are, differentiated by who is Han and who is non-Han, which means who is real Chinese and who is other than Chinese, like Mongols or Vietnamese or Koreans or somebody else. And believe it or not, this thing, although sometimes you can see it in in the state discrimination. So there would be, times that the non-Chinese or the non-Han Chinese, like people from Manchuria, Mongolia, or from the West, that is the Muslim part of China, they're discriminated and not given the jobs that they might be, entitled or qualified for. So this thing still goes on, and it has been all along the same thing. So discrimination, racial discrimination or ethnic discrimination, these things, they don't go away that easily. But things are, maybe improving for one or another ethnic group, but not so much for the Western Chinese or the Muslim Chinese. So I just wanted to tell you that the Han would become the name of the Chinese people. The former Han, that's the first part from 206 BC to 980. During this period, the capital was at Chang'an. Just like in Zhou Dynasty, the capital was removed or moved from the west to the east, and similarly the capital would be removed from the former Han, that is the Chang'an, to the later Han at Luoyang. So with the movement of the capital would be the change in the dynastic, cycle. The dynasty would be the same. But different emperors would come to rule, and you would see the difference between the two sets of rule. The former Han, one set of kings or emperors; the later Han, another set of kings or emperors for that reason. Also, this period is very important in the history of China. For one reason, it's a long period, 400 years, that's one. Second, it was during this period that China became much more known outside China. That is especially to the people of the West. That would be the Central Asian people of Central Asia. The countries I think we talked about in the first two sessions, if you remember, those are all those countries that end up the Stan, like Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan. That's Central Asia. And then from Chinese also became widely known among the Iranian people, the Persian people, as well as among the Arabs, and beyond that to the Greek people and under the Roman Empire. Now, the Han Dynasty, later on we would see, it also coincided with the Kushan dynasty or empire in India, as well as with the rise of the Roman Empire in Rome or in Europe. So just as the Han dynasty was bringing all the Chinese together under his control, the Romans were bringing non-Romans or non-Italians, that is the Greeks or the African people, under their control. So this is sort of two things happening at the same time, the making of empire, one in China and the other in Roman Empire. And then they would come in contact, and both would be well aware. During the Qin Dynasty, the Chinese were not so much aware of the people of India, or for that reason Arabia or Persia or the European, but during this time more Chinese would become aware of the Western people. That would be the people of Central Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe particularly. Let's see further. We start with the former Han Dynasty, and the Han Dynasty or the Han State. You might remember we ended with these different warring states in the last session, which ended the Qin Empire. So the Han State or the Han people, they came to power at the end of the Qin Empire. I just wanted to make that connection. The forces that ended the Qin Dynasty or the Qin Empire in 206 BC. Those forces led to the rise of the Han State, and Han State was one of the warring states. So it emerged, the Han State emerged victorious in the struggle for survival that so many states were fighting. And one of their great leaders, Liu Bang, the Han leader, he unified all the states under his Han Dynasty. Liu Bang himself, I mean that's his like a personal name. And he became the emperor and adopted an imperial name, Gaozu. So Gaozu, he was the Han leader, and he not only took good care of his people, the Han people, but he also, affiliated himself with other dynasties or other people in the region and unified them and went after all these people, the warring states, and brought them together under his control, and that's how he made his dynasty, the Han Dynasty, and became the emperor of the Han Dynasty. So Gaozu, he carries that type of a sort of leadership quality about himself, that he unified all the people and created a new dynasty, the Han Dynasty. All right, there he is, Emperor Gaozu. He ruled from 206 BC to 195 BC. Speaking of the BC, that is before Christ period, as you notice on the at the heading, that is the former Han Dynasty from 206 BC to 9 AD, the AD being now the after Anno Domini, after the birth of our Lord. That is a reference to Christ. So it was during the Han Dynasty in China that Christ was born in the Middle East. And he started his ministry during, the Han Dynasty. Although not that there is any connection between the Chinese Han Dynasty and the rise of Christ, but still just to, see what was happening, in China in the East and what was happening in the Middle East, at that time, Roman Palestine in the West. So this period is also very important for Christianity or the Middle East people with the rise of Christ in Roman Palestine and the spread of Christianity. And eventually, this religion, Christianity, would come to China, although not so soon, but you would see it, before even Islam would reach China, Christianity would come to China, and some people would adopt Christianity on the fringes of China, if not deep inside China. So I just wanted to let you know that this is the rise of Christ during this dynasty, the Han Dynasty. Let's see further. So Emperor Gaozu, he was from peasant origins. meaning that he really did not come from a great wealthy or scholarly family. So he was his parents were peasants. But a great person as he was, he unified all the people. He revived limited number of feudal estates to reward allies. Remember I said he allied himself with different people, and he brought all these people under his control. So those people who had helped him in becoming a king and establishing the Han Dynasty, he had to reward them, and that's why he had to revive a limited number of feudal estates by giving lands to his friends and family members to keep them happy and reward them so that they would stay happy with him. He built the Han capital at Chang'an, which is close to present-day Xi'an. And this capital would become like a great capital in the history of China, not only in the history of China, but in the whole world. Chang'an would be very famous place as it is even today. Also, as I told you in the beginning, he adopted sort of a mixture of legalism and a weak version of Taoism, which meant that he was a practical type of a pragmatic person. Legalism and Taoism, these are pole apart. They're very different philosophies. Legalism is like East and Taoism is like West. They're very pole apart, they're very different, completely opposite philosophies. But he realized if, legalism was not working, especially for the Qin Dynasty, it did not work for it, did not keep the Qin Dynasty for a long time in power. So he used it for some time and then dropped it and adopted Taoism. And believe it or not, the same dynasty would also adopt Confucianism. And this dynasty, just like the Qin Dynasty, was very much known for legalism. Because they adopted legalism as their state philosophy, there will come a time that Confucianism would become Confucianism would become the state philosophy of the Han Dynasty. So this would be I said legalism. What I mean Confucianism. Confucianism would become the state philosophy of the Han Dynasty, and this would be for the first time that you would see Confucianism becoming very powerful. Confucian scholars, they would become bureaucrats. They would gain high positions, although they would also create a lot of opposition to themselves, because whoever comes into power, that person or that position generates opposition. So similarly, the Confucian philosophy would also generate opposition to itself, just like legalism did in the previous dynasty, that is the Qin Dynasty. It benefited from legalism, but then it generated its own opposition and brought down the Qin Dynasty. So this would happen almost in the same thing to the Han Dynasty. Let's see further. Gaozu, as I said, he came from peasant, family. He was not really a great scholar, so that's why he denigrated Confucian scholars, and he was very much legalist person. He also, went along with Taoism for some time, but he really did not like Confucian scholars. And there is a story, how he denigrated the Confucian scholars. This is the time that he even burned their books. He killed them. He also showed a sort of a, high disrespect in the Chinese culture when he once urinated in the hat of a Confucian scholar. That just he wanted to show his disgust for the Confucian scholars. He was very much against them, very much against them. He burned their books, and there are stories of Confucian scholars, buried alive. So he punished them. One reason for that could be that he himself, came from an illiterate family. Confucianists very high on education, as you know already. Very high on education, very high on ethics and morality. and they always preached to the people from powerful positions of the state. So that could be one reason that he did not like them. But later on, he would realize the value of Confucianism. The Han Dynasty itself would become a Confucian dynasty. So keep in mind the beginning of the rule under Gaozu. Confucianist and Confucian scholars and the philosophy itself was under fire. Later on, the Han Dynasty would realize the value of Confucianism and would adopt it. Let's see further. Emperor Gaozu, as I said, he would later on turn to Confucianism when he realized that it was a good philosophy, but before that, he brutalized Confucian scholars. He also learned from Confucian scholars how to become a sage emperor. That's what, Confucian scholars believed, that if you want to be a great emperor, you have to act like sage emperors. Now, who are these sage emperors? These were people from the Zhou dynasty, or even before the Zhou dynasty in the Shang dynasty. And so these people acted very graciously, and they were very successful emperors. And the success of these people, was the proof was that people had a lot of peace, they had a lot of prosperity. That was the proof of the success of these emperors, and that's why they are called sage emperors. Sage means wise. A wise emperor, wise king was the one who took care of the people, gave them peace and prosperity. Gaozu also reduced taxes and free labor. That was the hallmark of the Qin Dynasty. So he turned against the Qin Dynasty measures. So he reduced taxes and free labor. He also abolished conscription, what we call draft. So he stopped people from being forcibly recruited in the army. And the reason for that was, since he came from peasant, background, if you recruit or force all the young men, into an army and tell them, okay, go ahead and, you have to build this Great Wall of China, or you have to constantly fight and guard against the Mongols in the north, that would not leave many people for agriculture. Yes, you would guard and, your borders, but your people would be hungry. So he needed most of the young men to concentrate, focus on agriculture and get good production first. Feed people, make people happy with yourself, and then we would see, that was his philosophy, we would see about the Mongols. So that's why he abolished conscription, draft, and focused and wanted these young men to engage in agriculture and agriculture production, and also trade and business, as we will see. Okay, let's see further. After him, we see another great, after Gaozu, another great king of the former Han Dynasty by the name Wudi. His rule from about 141 BC to 87 BC. That is a long time for one person to rule. But then, as I said, Han Dynasty was a strong dynasty. It ruled for 400 years, and so it had a lot of wonderful kings, emperors, and Wudi was one of the first in the former Han Dynasty. Wudi, he is the seventh, or was the seventh emperor of the Han Dynasty. Very successful person. He is also known as the martial emperor because much more focused on, like a very energetic person, very intelligent person. So he was full of energy, and that's why he's called the martial emperor, because he also paid much more attention to the military aspect of his dynasty. However, he had a problem, and that problem was he was suspicious of everybody and everything. And also he was very vengeful person. He did not forgive people. That was not his, one of his good characteristics. Very suspicious, very revengeful person. That made him to be a little bit, compared to the sage emperors, to be a brutal person. He amassed all the powers that there was in China. So he was like himself the emperor, the prime minister, the king, the minister, and he controlled everything in the dynasty or in the empire. So he personally micromanaged, if I can use this, modern term, and watched everything himself. Now, somebody might say, well, that's very good that he did all these things himself. Well, that's not very good, because if an emperor, he watches everything, he manages everything, pretty soon all these everythings would consume his energies. So that's not good for him. So he has to trust people and let them do most of the things. So he could not be, he roamed a lot. He traveled a lot in China because he had to see things for himself. So if he ordered a canal, he believed that this canal would not be dug, would not be prepared, there would not be water if he himself did not go there and watch the digging of the canal and watch himself the bringing of the water into the canal, that sort of thing. If he ordered, the extension of, which he did, the extension of the Great Wall of China into certain pieces to stop the Mongols from invading China, he had to be there himself. So, China being a huge big country, to how many projects and how many places he could be always there. So that consumed, his energies, and it could be just that reason that he did not trust people. He became very revengeful person. If people disobeyed him or did not do things the way he wanted, in right time and with the right condition, if they didn't do it, he became like a Qin emperor, punishing people very severely. So hence that revengeful, nature of him. He was also very suspicious of people. So what he did, he created a sort of intelligence department of the Han Dynasty, a huge big force, number of spies he recruited. So whatever went on in the dynasty or in the empire, there would be a spy, watching people every time. And so people were also, they knew, what he had for them, like these spies in different places. So they were careful, not to cross him or not to disobey him because they knew the consequences. So that's how he ruled. He ruled for a long time, no question about that. He did a lot of great things, and one of them would be to stop the Mongols from invading China, which was always a chronic, problem for the Chinese people, right from the Qin Dynasty down the road, to other dynasties, and he controlled them. So let's see further what else did he do, Emperor Wudi. Some people say that he turned Buddhist. Now, the images that we have, the paintings that we have, him turning to Buddhism, that could be a little bit suspicious. Personally, I really do not believe in it, but most of these images, they come from the Buddhist painting. And so that's why some scholars, they don't believe in these things, But I just wanted to bring here that who knows, him, Wudi, turning to Buddhism. One reason that many scholars do not believe in that, because Buddhism came 100 years after, when he was dead and gone. So that is just one reason. Or if he became Buddhist, by the preaching of one Buddhist monk or scholar, that could be possible, but most scholars believe this was just a Buddhist propaganda saying that Wudi turned to Buddhism for answers. He was very much focused on agriculture, and he dug canals between the Yellow River in the north and his capital, which is a little bit, to the southern bend of the Yellow River. So this was like a great accomplishment that he achieved, the digging of this canal. He also, on the way, he connected quite a few rivers, when he brought the river to his capital, Chang'an. So that a major, great project. And China would later on would be known for these great projects, as the Three Gorges, dam that we talked about, and it's still going on. He also had these, what's called the ever-level granaries. Granaries, these are food storehouses where he could keep the grain, like wheat or barley or rice, in stores that were arranged by the state, made by the state, just in case if there was drought, and lack of food. So he would give people food from these state-operated or managed granaries, storehouses. That was a good thing. He heavily taxed merchants. Now that he was becoming a little bit more confusion, he did not like merchants. And so he monopolized the production of so many things, and some of them like copper, salt, iron, and liquor. because salt and iron and liquor widely used. So he monopolized the production of all these items, and if anybody needed these items for whatever reason, to make anything out of them, they had to buy it from the state, because the state was the owner of these metals, and they had to buy it. So that is how the state, by monopolizing the production of these items, the state gained more money. So this was one sort of measure for the Han Dynasty under Wudi to get more and more money. Not many people like this thing, especially the merchant class people did not like. They wanted everything, free or minimum prices, and so now the state controlled the price and they paid a little bit higher, for these items, and that's how they did not like it. So the merchant class was not, happy with Wudi. Let's see further. Emperor Wudi, he expanded the borders. Of course, he had to take care of the borders, and the best way to take care was to take the war to the Mongols or the Vietnamese north and south. So he went up to Manchuria, modern-day Korea and Vietnam, Manchuria northeast, Manchuria northeast and Korea northeast and Vietnam in the south. So he expanded border in the north, northeast, and south. He also controlled the Xiongnu people. These people were the nightmare of the Chinese people. And as you know, these people, Xiongnu, they're called the Huns, Huns among European people. So they were very brutal people, always, attacking and raiding other people, looting and massacring people. These were, Xiongnu, tough people, the nightmare of the Chinese people. However, Wudi controlled them. He utilized different ways to control them. One was to use some of these barbarians against other Xiongnu tribes. So he would bribe one tribe to invade another tribe, and that's how he would weaken all of them. He also used trade, titles, bribes, and brides. He would give one tribe trade privileges, come do trade and business with us, by which they gain more and more money. Sometimes he would give titles to them, to the leaders of a particular one or another tribe. That would make other tribal leaders jealous, and they would be begging for the same privileges, the trade and title privileges, and they would come and submit to Wudi or the future Han emperors. Sometimes he would just give them money, gold or copper or whatever they needed. And there were times when he sent Chinese brides, not of maybe sometimes, Han people, but Chinese brides, he sent them and, to marry these barbarians. Now there could be, it looks like, sort of a brutal thing to be done to a young woman, Chinese woman taken from her house and sent to the north to live among barbarian people whose language she did not speak, right? And whose culture these Chinese young women did not understand. So to be completely, put in a different, on a different planet as Mongolia and these Mongols and the Xiongnu people were, it must have been, of course, very tough for the Chinese women, but they did it. They did it, number one, it was, keeping the honor of the family. A Chinese young woman would not refuse whatever her parents told her to marry this man or that man or in this place or that place. However, the suffering of the Chinese young women living as wives of the barbarian, the Xiongnu or the Huns or any other Mongol people, created a literature of its own, which is a beautiful literature, full of sorrows, how this Chinese, the Chinese ladies, they lived among Mongols. Of course, they would try their best to sinicize or sort of spread the Chinese culture among the Mongols, but they were just a minority of one surrounded by so many people, but they produced. They could read and write, so they produced their own literature, beautiful poetry, mostly poetry in which they expressed, their emotions, their sorrows, that nobody was there really to take, care of them or help them. They were just surrounded by, a bunch of barbarians, and that's what, life went on for a lot of Chinese women when they were given into marriages with different Mongol leaders. So that's what I wanted to show you, the trade, the titles, the bribes, and the brides that worked, during the Han Dynasty with the Mongols, and how Wudi controlled the Xiongnu people. Let's see further. Also, it was during Wudi time that he defeated the Xiongnu in Mongolia. He took the war to the Xiongnu people. This was a big massacre of the Xiongnu, and that was in a way good for the for Chinese people, so they would be at least in peace. All right, the Han Empire, there it is, and still expanding. After the Han, this would further expand to different places. I just want to, this is modern day Manchuria and Korea. Under Wudi expanded. Right here is the Vietnam, northern Vietnam area, so he expanded to Vietnam, and he brought almost entire Tarim Basin, and further west the Mongolite people, and here is Mongolia, the Xiongnu people living on this edge of the Chinese Han Empire. And so he took this the war to the Xiongnu people, and that's how he controlled them. And now this was a wonderful thing happening for China, this extension of the Chinese empire into the west. And right here is Central Asia. A little down here is Iran, or right here is the Middle East, Arabia. Here is Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then India. So it was during the Han Dynasty that the Chinese went further and further into the west. So I wanted to show you the Han Empire borders. All right, Wudi sending Zhang Jian, a great scholar. He was an intellectual person as well as a military person, Zhang Jian. He sent him to the west, just I showed you, to Central Asia, to bring him more information about the people of Central Asia, the people of Iran and India, and that is where Zhang Jian, he went. When he came back, by that time, there was no Emperor Wudi, so that's how, but that knowledge was utilized by later, people. This was good in the sense that more and more Chinese would go west under, Zhang Jian influences. He brought accounts, he wrote accounts, what he saw in the west. And his accounts are full of two things. Number one, it gave the Chinese people, those who would read and write, those who were in the business of knowing other people, the state people especially, the bureaucrats, he gave them sort of assurance that the Chinese civilization is the best that there could be. So he gave them the confidence that we have a lot in our borders in China. We have a lot of food, we have a lot of peace and prosperity, so that was good for people to read, and he encouraged people to read. Another thing was that there is still a lot of possibility to expand into the West and to come in contact with other people. So he gave them the stories of Persia, of Central Asia, of India, and the one that he had heard about the Arabs, or the Romans, or the Byzantine Empire. I mean, the Byzantine people at that time, although there was no Byzantine, that would be the Greek people, the Eastern European people. So he fed the Chinese with all his accounts, and that sort of encouraged people to go west and find for themselves. And that's what the great value of his writing is in the history of China. Let's see further. Emperor Wudi, he extended the Great Wall of China to protect further Chinese people. He also conquered this western lands and the Tarim Basin. This is a huge big basin that I would show it to you, and he settled 700,000 people on Chinese people on Xiongnu lands. So he conquered the Xiongnu, the Hun's lands, the Mongol lands, and settled the Chinese people. So these Chinese people, at one time 700,000 people, he settled them so that they could spread Chinese language, Chinese culture among the Mongols, and that is how he would bring these people under the Chinese civilization, just like the Romans would do the same thing. They would conquer a place and settle Romans, so that Roman soldiers and other Roman people, so that they could spread the Roman civilization among the people of other countries. This is the Tarim Basin. This basin is the largest basin on planet Earth. It's huge and big, and surrounded by what you see. This is snow. These are in the west, southwest. These are the Kunlun Mountains. Down here is the Himalaya Mountains. So these are the Kunlun Mountains, and these are the Tian Shan Mountains. And both these mountains, they melt. I mean, their snow melt in the basin, and it is also home to what is called Taklamakan Desert, one of the magnificent deserts, very tough deserts here. But then still, in this basin and in this desert, you have water, you have rivers, and there is life, and a lot of people live here. And both the ridges of these two, this southern ridge or the southern bank sort of, and the northeastern bank, these two became the great ways for the Chinese to get out of China and contact people in the West, that is Central Asia, Iran, India, and Arabia. So very important place in China. It is, most of it is in the Western China area. Okay, so he conquered the Mongols and settled the Chinese people, and this led to, in peacetime, the establishment of the Silk Road. It was during Wudi time that the Silk Road was established for trade and business between China and the West. And let's see some of the Silk Road stuff. This is again right here, China, Han China. This is that Tarim Basin I talked about. Here is Central Asia. There is Iran right here. This is Pakistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. And this is Saudi Arabia. This area is, like modern day Turkey right there. Here is Syria, Palestine, and Israel, and this is Egypt, just to give you a sense of what this place is. Very important place. This is Eastern Mediterranean Sea. So right here is Greece, and there would be, Rome, and further go, Germany, France, and you get into, even as a north west as England. So let's see this great Silk Road. Here is, as I said, the Han Empire, the Kushan Empire in India, the Parthian Empire in Persia or Iran, and the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean Sea. So the Greeks were by this time under the Roman control. And that is the Chang'an, the capital of the Han Empire. And it was from this city, Chang'an, which is now called Xi'an, that the Great Silk Road started. Going west and going, up and down the Tarim Basin, joining again, going into India, Persia, and Middle East, and the Roman Empire, and even as far southwest or northwest to Egypt. So these are just only a few branches. There were many more branches that went into different directions, but all this would be called the Silk Road, a very important road in the history of communication, trade, and business. The first one to give you sort of a, if I can use the modern terminology, globalized trade and business. And this is, you have it, about 200 years, before Christ, during that period. Some people believe that it started even, a little bit going to the west in the Qin Dynasty, but the Han Dynasty perfected it. And it would be used again and again, after the Han. Let's see further. The Silk Road. Merchants being robbed, quite a common phenomena, because that area was not under the control of any great empire, so there were a lot of robbers, and the merchants' accounts of the robbers. But still, the trade went on. Here you see Buddha. This is Gandhara Buddha. That is modern day Pakistan, where it was made, and to be completely precise about it, my home city. Peshawar was the capital of this great state, Gandhara, which was a Buddhist state. These are Asian Buddhist monks. That Buddhism was coming, into China by the Silk Road, and how the Silk Road was spreading different religions into China. Buddhism being the first that came. Chinese jade items that left China went to Central Asia and even as far west as Rome. Now remember, Romans were the one who could pay for all this great stuff, the silk stuff and jade stuff that came out of China. So that's how there is something about this Silk Road. As silk and jade went from China to Rome, what came in return? Mostly gold. So the Chinese sucked a lot of Roman gold, and that is believed to be later on one of the reasons for the fall of the Roman Empire, that the Roman lost so much gold to the Chinese and made Chinese very, prosperous, very powerful. This would be something even today. A lot of Americans and Europeans, they complain that more and more trade and business and material is coming from China, right? And more dollars and gold is going to China out of America, and that is true. China has the largest amount of dollars outside United States. And for that reason, because of this, trade imbalance, as it is called now, more Chinese are selling to the Americans, and they buy less and less from Americans. That's the American complaint, and that's how Chinese ended to having so much, huge big amount in billions, the American dollars. And they of course they invested, inside China and outside China. So this thing is not new. This trade imbalance with Chinese not buying but selling to everybody. This is from 200 years before Christ, and still going on 2,000 years after Christ, the same phenomena. So remember, the Silk Road is still on, okay, without the road. Okay, let's see further. On the Silk Road, foreign merchants bringing their merchandises to China, and of course the Chinese very pragmatic. They would buy only whatever they needed, and since they had a lot of their own stuff, that's why foreign items did not work or could not be sold, as much in China as we see it even today. A Han horse going west, Western travelers and warriors coming to China. Now, these Western travelers, Europeans or European-looking people from Central Asia, Iran or Persia, just so recently they have found a lot of Caucasian or European-looking people in Western China. I remember, some studies being done, some excavations, and they wonder, why these European people were buried in China. Well, these are not really, my theory is they are not really Europeans. They could be Iranians, they could be Indian, they could be people from modern day Pakistan and Afghanistan that went to Western China and did business with these people. And they also look very Caucasite, very European looking people, people in northern Pakistan or in Afghanistan or northwestern India. A lot of Caucasian looking people that area has, and so they could be those people who went to China. It doesn't have to be a French or a German or an Englishman or an Italian coming to China. They could be any people between China and Italy or Greece. So that's why some of these people, they look very Caucasian, coming from modern day northwestern India, Pakistan and Afghanistan or Iran. Let's see further. Persian textile and legends. Some of these things coming out of Persia into China. Some Persian religions also went to China, but not really deep inside China. They became settled in western part of China, like the Muslim part of China. This is, very later on, Marco Polo, a great European traveler. He went to China and met, Genghis Khan, the great Khan. the Yuan dynasty that we will talk about later on. So this is a little bit later, but just to tell you that how late, that would be 13th and 14th century, this great Silk Road was used. Once the Han Dynasty established 200 years before, it would go on and keep on going. And some people, they constructed in the region their own Silk Roads parallel to the old Silk Road. I've been on one in the Karakora Mountains. That is the border area between Pakistan and China. I took a group of 20 students and they loved it. It's a magnificent road that the Pakistani government and the Chinese made it during 1979 and 1980. And still business, is booming on that road between China and Pakistan, and now further expanding into even India and the Middle East. Let's see further. Okay, that was enough of the Silk Road. Now we are going into the decline of the former Han Dynasty. So with the death of Emperor Wudi, and that's unfortunately the history of China. With the death of any strong emperor, then you see the decline of the dynasty or his family. And that's what happened, unfortunately, after the people that came after Wudi. Landlords stopped paying taxes because nobody could get them from them. The state imposed more taxes on peasants, small landowners. The poor people, they had to pay a big price because the landlords would not pay the taxes. So that alienated the peasants, the poor people. In some countries, you see that even today. You cannot get taxes from the rich people, so the poor people ended up paying the most. Peasants revolted in 22 BC. This would not be the first nor the last time that peasant would revolt. And peasant revolts are very, or were very common problems in China. These revolts would also show us that the mandate of heaven is just about to be taken from the dynasty and given to another dynasty. So that meant this is the end of the existing dynasty and the beginning of another dynasty. Peasant revolts, very important sign in the dynastic cycle. Palace intrigues and succession of weak emperors after Wudi, you see that a lot. Weak emperors coming to the forefront, brought by force, some of them, to become kings, even if they did not want to. Some of them were minors, children were made emperors, and so that's how, the Han Dynasty, the former Han Dynasty collapsed. Till Wang Monk, a regent. This was not really a Han person, an outsider person, but he had, given his daughter or women to the Han people. And that's how he came close to the Han Dynasty. And so what he did, he deposed the little child that he had made the emperor of China. He was a great military officer, Wang Monk, great military officer, and he himself became the emperor, and that's why he is known as the usurper. From 8 to 23 AD he ruled, Wang Monk. Let's see what he did. He turned Confucian, which helped him, Confucianism. He expanded the state monopoly on a lot of other things that was very common, the state monopoly. Confiscated private estates from these very powerful landlords and very rich merchants. They lost their lands. The eunuchs, they lost their power. Corrupt bureaucrats, they lost their power under Wang Monk administration or regime or dynasty, the Han Dynasty. And all these people, the landlords, the merchants, the powerful eunuchs, the corrupt bureaucrats, they opposed his reforms. So there is something about Wang Monk. He wanted to, clean the bond. He wanted to create good times in China by focusing on the land, focusing on the people, but unfortunately he had, alienated these very powerful people. I just mentioned eunuchs. Eunuchs in China, very powerful people. Some of them were naturally born eunuchs. Some of them, their families, when they were, young children, before, a boy hit puberty, before he became of age, and became sexually aware, his testicles were removed from him. And so that's how, the boy was made eunuch. Now, why they would do that? Well, they would give that boy to the state service, to the dynasty. He would be trained, and so within 15 years, he would be trained, and he would know the in and out of the administration. And just because he did not have sexual desires or he couldn't do any sexual activity, he would not have wife, he would not have children, which meant he would not have family. So he was married, in fact, to the state. And that is why he would give his 100% total dedication to the service of the state, to the service of the dynasty and the the Han Empire. So these were very dedicated servants, bureaucrats, very powerful bureaucrats in the service of the dynasty or empire. Now, not only they were in the civil administration, they were also in the military, administration also. They were very powerful generals, very powerful officers, and some of them were sort of, like kingmakers, if I can call them. So here, the eunuchs. Let's see further. He, as I said, he alienated people, and now the Yellow River also acted against him, overflooding, which meant, that nature was against him. The Xiongnu people, they started invading, China, not only China, but also the, capital of the Han Dynasty. A group of people called the Red Eyebro People. The Red Eyebro People, they revolted. These were peasants, in fact, so they made their own group, by putting that red color on the eyebrow, so that gave them a sort of a, group identity. And they revolted against Wang Monk, rule. And at one time, in 23 AD, his own troops, they joined the rebels, and they entered the palace and murdered Wang Monk. And that was the end of sort of, the Wang Monk dynasty, or the Wang Monk period in the Han dynasty. So after him, you see the rise of what is called the later Han, from 25 AD to 220 AD, still, 200 years rule of the later Han. One prince, Liu Xiu, he became the emperor, and so his imperial name would be known as Guang Wudi. Don't confuse him that other, former Han dynasty Wudi. He is called Guang Wudi. He ruled from 25 AD to 57 AD. He was a young man. He came to power. So it was under his rule that the capital was moved from Chang'an to Luoyang, and that's why this dynasty is called the later Han or the Eastern Han, because the capital was moved from the west, Chang'an, to the east at Luoyang. He also defeated rebels and the Xiongnu people. A young and energetic person, he improved the peasants' economy. Agriculture was now starting a little bit, booming, and that helped China to prosper again under Guang Wudi. So that was good. But unfortunately, after him, there were these vigorous great emperors who came to power in the initial period of the later Han, dynasty, but unfortunately, after him, you see a lot of problems. Xiongnu attacks, were stopped during that period, the initial period of the great kings like himself. Chinese border again expanded to North Vietnam and Korea. Most of Xinjiang, that is Xinjiang of the western area, was brought under the Chinese rule. So that was good in the sense that once again, when the western part of China, which is Xinjiang, that was brought under the Chinese, again, there could be trade and business between China and the West, that is Central Asia and Arabia. So it all happened from about 25 to 100 AD. But unfortunately, after 100 AD, you see, again, weak rulers, the same problems. And so the last 100 years, of the later Han were full of troubles and full of problems. Let's see. Later Han period. A great commander, Ban Chao, he went to West, to Central Asia. He almost like settled there, by the later Han people. So he was settled in Central Asia. He exterminated the Xiongnu people, a great commander. But this was just one episode, of the one great commander doing all these great things. His importance is that some people believe that he was like the first Chinese officer who went as far, as Ukraine, that is like a sort of, Europe, and even beyond that, some people believe. So the importance of Ban Chao would be that he brought Central Asia and especially the Xiongnu people under the Han Dynasty, under the Chinese control, and he went as far west as Ukraine and made contacts with the European people, and his accounts give us a lot about Persia, about Ukraine, about even Greece and other European, looking people. So that was one of the great things that happened during the later Han Dynasty. The Silk Road again became safer for caravan trade. Merchants prospered, of course, whenever there is more, trade and business going on. So merchants prospered, landlords, they gained more power. That's another thing. Sometimes this, gaining power happened at the expense of the central government. So the central government lost power to wealthy merchants and landlords. That was not good, and this would be the, sort of the beginning of the trouble for the dynasty, when it would become weak and other people would be strong. Also, after, as I said, 100 AD, palace politics, intrigues by different wives and concubines of the emperor, they started, and that was not good. So the trouble inside the palace started by different wives, different concubines. They wanted to bring their sons, respective sons, to become the next emperor. And violent succession to the throne. Some of them got killed by rival, contenders to the throne. Eunuchs, they slaughtered royal family members. This shows how powerful the eunuchs were. Castrated, yes, sexually impotent, but politically and militarily very powerful people. Okay, so, and eunuchs not only in China but also in other cultures they were used. So some of these military officers, the general, they deposed emperors one after another. So that tells you that the royal family, the Han family, had lost power. After again 180 powerful landlords exploited farmers and avoided taxes. That means they did not pay taxes, but they gained and got a lot of taxes from their poor farmers, landless people who were agriculture people. Peasants' revolts multiplied, of course. That's the first sign of the trouble for the dynasty. This time, the yellow turban people, they revolted. And so the yellow turban rebellion or revolt in 184 AD was a major sign of the peasants' revolt and how people were suffering. Army generals, they suppressed uprising and gained wealth because the dynasty needed these revolts to be put down, to be crushed. So they needed army officers. And so the more the army officers were needed, the more these officers, they gained power at the expense of the kings. So that's how, they became so powerful, they started even deposing the emperors. In 220 AD, military officer, they deposed one emperor, and that led to the rise of further troubles for the dynasty. So a common feature, very common feature in the history of China, when the dynasty would be just about to lose power, you would see all these problems. Peasants revolting, lawlessness, chaos, confusion, conflict would start. And there, in different places in China, just to protect themselves, different people, they would make their own dynasties. They would make their own, enclaves of power and would threaten the imperial family. And that's what happened exactly in the Han Dynasty, because let's see what happened, how other families rose to power. After about 220 AD, the end of the Han Dynasty happened, like 3 kingdoms, or as they're called, the 6 dynasties came to power. And boy, they like went and ruled forever from 220 AD to 589 AD. These three kingdoms, very powerful kingdoms, they ruled in China, and they are called the six dynasties kingdoms. So this is Chang'an, the capital of the Han Dynasty. And let's see these three kingdoms now: the Shu, the Wei, and the Wu. These three kingdoms, they, created their power at the expense of the Han Dynasty, which was stuck in the west in Chang'an. And so the real power now belonged to these enclaves. And as you can see it, each and every power, family, the Wei, the Shu, and the Wu, each family and each people, they benefited from a major river. So right here is the Yangtze, and here a sort of connected one to the Yellow River. So they had their own agricultural basis, to have a lot of food, a lot of production, which they used to recruit more people in their army and to protect themselves, and would make it very difficult for any one dynasty to bring them under their control. So that's the reason, these enclaves of power, different pockets, so to speak, or states of power rising at the expense of the imperial dynasty, the Han Dynasty, whose capital, as I said, was in Chang'an. So power went to the fringes. From the center, it went to the fringes, and that was not good for China. So somebody had to come and bring again all these people under one control, and that we'll see later on. So the three kingdoms, the six dynasties, created political turmoil in China. Of course, that was that natural, very natural result. During this period, you see a lot of bloodshed in China. Some people call it the bloodiest period in China, and a very long one, okay, very long one. So this was the sign of the turning of the dynastic cycle. So the cycle was turning, and so that's why, all these troubles. It's lasted till the rise of the Sui and the Tang dynasty that we would talk about later on. So right here, as you see it, the Han dynasty is coming to an end. China is divided up again into different enclaves of power. Different people came to power, and they are holding to that power. So you have to wait for someone to come and wipe them all, and bring all the lands and the places and the people under one control. So that would be the Sui dynasty, and the Tang dynasty would follow exactly the same thing. So again, just to sort of give you the review of the present session, that was, keep in mind the unification of China, very important. And the breakup of China into different pieces, that would be the sign of the dynastic cycle turning in, which means that the present dynasty is going down in history. And this is exactly the time for another dynasty to rise up. So they are losing the mandate of heaven, the authority of heaven, of God, or God as they call it. And so God or heaven is bringing somebody else into power to bring the Chinese people together and create peace and prosperity. So again and again, this would repeat itself in the history of China. And so that's what happened also to the Han dynasty. Very powerful dynasty that ruled for 400 years. But then there is a limit to any rule, to any power, and that's how the Han proved it, the limit to their power also. So let's see what we did today. In conclusion, we talked about the former Han dynasty, and also how in the former Han dynasty the great Emperor Wudi, who was of peasant origins, and how he brought the dynasty under his rule. Also how the Han dynasty got control over the Xiongnu and stop, sort of put an end to this nightmare of the Chinese people by controlling them. However, this control would not last forever, and so the Xiongnu would get their own, time, another time to come and raid and loot China. Han dynasty also very much known for the Silk Road. So we saw the Silk Road, how it went from Chang'an, the capital of the former Han Dynasty, and how from out of China it went to west into Central Asia, into India, into Iran, Persia, and Arabia, and Greece, and even up to Rome. The Silk Road was not only an outlet of the Chinese item products into West, but it was also a road or an inlet for different philosophies, different religions that would come on this road to China. So that's why the Silk Road, keep in mind, is not only a road to do business and products, but also exchange ideas that came to China. Then the later Han Dynasty, the Silk Road would get into trouble because of the Xiongnu, the Xiongnu invasions, and as the Han Dynasty got weaker and weaker, the trouble, you would see more and more trouble rising up for the dynasty, and that would bring the later Han to the period of what is called the three kingdoms, different kingdoms, three major kingdoms rising up in China, breaking up China into pieces, and then that would lead to the end of the Han Dynasty, because the Han Dynasty lost power to these three kingdoms. Now, amazingly, during this very bloody period, the Three Kingdom period in China that went for more than 300 years, amazingly, production within these enclaves went on. They were fighting, yes, but this is also a time of a lot of production in China. So the local people, the local craftsmen, kept on producing different items. And so that's why, while you see overall for China problems, at least in different places, something good would be also going on. And we would see later on how all China would be brought under the Sui and the Tang Dynasty next time. Thank you very much for tuning in. Aloha.